Calls police to her home across the street from Maddie's home. She's made a gruesome discovery in her 14-year-old's bedroom. A body is stuffed in his waterbed.
We found Maddie Clifton this morning at about 7:30 a.m. She was dead. I'm here to announce the arrest of Joshua Earl Patrick Phillips.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree as charged in the indictment.
Joshua Earl Patrick Phillips, it is the sentence of this court that you be confined in prison without the benefit of parole for the rest.
There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a neighborhood when something is wrong. Not the silence of a quiet evening, not the comfortable hush of porch lights flickering on and families gathering inside for dinner. This is a different kind, heavier. The kind that presses against your chest before your mind has fully caught up with what your instincts already know. That silence fell over Lakewood, Jacksonville, on the night of November 3rd, 1998. It started the way most fears do, quietly and without warning. A mother stepped to her front door just after 6:30 in the evening, the way mothers do when dinner is ready and the last of the daylight is fading. She called a name. She waited. She called again. The street gave nothing back but the rustle of oak leaves and the distant sound of a television playing somewhere down the block. Her daughter had not come home. What followed in the hours after that moment was something the residents of Lakewood would carry with them for the rest of their lives, not as a memory they could set down, but as one permanently woven into who they became. Flashlights appeared first, one, then three, then dozens, cutting slow arcs through front yards and side alleys, sweeping across hedges and beneath parked cars. Neighbors who had never spoken beyond a wave now stood shoulder to shoulder in the street, organizing themselves without being asked, moving in quiet, deliberate patterns through the dark. They called her name, not loudly, and that detail matters. There was something in the way they called it, or controlled, careful, as though raising their voices too high might disturb something fragile, might confirm something none of them were ready to say out loud. Maddie. Maddie. Children were pulled inside and doors were locked, some for the first time in years. Parents stood at windows, watching the flashlight beams move through the dark, their hands resting on their children's shoulders without quite realizing it. Because this neighborhood did not do this. This was not the kind of place where children disappeared. This was Lakewood, where kids knocked on each other's doors without calling ahead, where the streets were safe enough that parents didn't track the time, where the biggest concern on a warm November afternoon was whether the kids remembered to come in before dark. And yet, here they were, standing in the street at midnight, me calling a name into the silence. Law enforcement arrived within hours of the initial report. Patrol units first, then detectives, then, as the hours stretched into a second day, and the second day stretched into a third, specialized units, federal investigators, search and rescue teams equipped with tools that no one in this neighborhood ever imagined would be necessary here. Helicopters moved overhead in slow, methodical grids. K-9 units worked the perimeter. Drainage systems were checked. Wooded areas were combed. A reward was announced, and still, nothing. No physical evidence, no signs of struggle, no trail leading anywhere. In missing persons investigations, law enforcement will tell you that the absence of evidence is not the same as the absence of a crime. Sometimes, a scene that appears undisturbed is the most carefully constructed detail of all. The neighborhood held its breath. And somewhere, in a house on that same street, in a room that had already been walked through, in a space that had already been cleared, the answer was waiting. It had been there the entire time. Before we go any further into what happened, we need to stop here. Because the easiest thing to do with a case like this, the most common mistake in true crime storytelling, is to let the crime become the story. To let the worst moment of someone's life eclipse every moment that came before it. Maddie Clifton deserves better than that. And if you're watching from wherever you are right now, whether it's a quiet morning with your coffee, a late night when you can't sleep, or somewhere in between, I want you to hold this part, because this is the part that matters most. Her full name was Molin Ray Clifton, but nobody called her that. She was Maddie, always Maddie, She was 8 years old, the kind of 8 that feels like it contains multitudes. Not a little kid anymore, but not yet the version of herself she was becoming. Knew she existed in that particular window of childhood where the world is still mostly wonder, where a basketball in the driveway and a piano in the living room and a warm afternoon outside are genuinely enough. And for Maddie, they were. Her parents, Steve and Sheila Clifton, raised her in a home that was full in the way that matters. Not just with things, but with presence, with attention, with the kind of everyday love that doesn't announce itself, but shows up in the details. In the way a parent learns which songs their child hums without realizing it. In the way they know, without being told, when something is wrong. Maddie had a sister, and like most sisters, they shared the particular language of siblings, the shorthand, the inside jokes, the quiet competition, the deeper loyalty underneath all of it. She was not a child who sat still easily. Movement was her natural state. On any given afternoon, she might be outside with a basketball, working on a move she'd seen somewhere, and decided she could replicate. Or she'd be at the piano, fingers finding notes with a focus that surprised people. Because from the outside, Maddie seemed like pure energy. But sit her down at those keys and something shifted. She could concentrate. She could listen. That contradiction, the restless spirit and the quiet focus, was part of what made her memorable. But what people talked about most, what neighbors reached for when they tried to explain who she was, wasn't her energy or her talent. It was her awareness of other people. Maddie noticed when someone was left out. Not in a passive way, not the way most children register it and move on. She acted on it. If a child was standing at the edge of a group, uncertain, Maddie would cross the yard, introduce herself, and bring them in. Not because she was taught to perform kindness, but because exclusion genuinely bothered her. One neighbor, reflecting on her years later, said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. She wasn't just her parents' child, she was everyone's child. That is not a small thing to say about an 8-year-old. It is, in fact, everything. She lived on a street where childhood still looked the way it used to, where kids showed up at each other's doors unannounced, where parents trusted the neighborhood the way you trust something you've never had reason to question. Maddie moved through that world freely, knocking on doors, calling names from driveways, pulling friends into whatever the afternoon had become. It was ordinary. It was safe. It was exactly the kind of life that makes what comes next so difficult to absorb. November 3rd, 1998 was a Tuesday. It was the kind of early winter afternoon that Jacksonville does differently from the rest of the country. Warm enough that a jacket felt unnecessary, the air carrying just enough of a breeze to make being outside feel like a small gift. The kind of afternoon that invites exactly what Maddie was doing. She was outside, moving, alive in the way that only children in motion truly are. At some point in the early afternoon, she had picked up a golf club, not out of any serious athletic ambition, just the way kids repurpose whatever is available into something worth doing. She was hitting balls along the street, and back and forth, the way you do when the game is less about the sport and more about the rhythm of it, the satisfying crack of contact, the watching it roll. Neighbors saw her. This detail matters. She was visible, present, unremarkable in the best possible sense. Nothing about that afternoon signaled anything other than what it appeared to be. She was a child playing outside on a warm Tuesday afternoon. The window investigators would later focus on was narrow. Somewhere between 4:30 and 5:30 in the evening, Maddie was last seen, not by a stranger, not at a distance, by people who knew her, people who lived on that street, who recognized her the way you recognize someone who belongs to your daily landscape. She was there, and then, in the way that only becomes significant in retrospect, she wasn't. No one heard anything unusual. No one saw anything that registered as wrong. No car that didn't belong. No raised voices. No moment that anyone would later point to and say, that was it. That was the moment. It simply went quiet. By 6:30 in the evening, Sheila Clifton was at the door. Dinner was ready. The light was fading. It was time to come in. She called Maddie's name. The street gave nothing back. Her sister came home. Maddie didn't. What followed in those first minutes? The checking of the yard, the knocking on neighbors' doors, the growing certainty that something was not right, moved the way these things always do at first. Slowly, then all at once. Confusion giving way to concern. Concern giving way to something that sat lower and heavier in the chest. Up by the time Steve Clifton called Jacksonville Sheriff's Office that evening, the family already knew, the way families know, that this was not a child who had simply lost track of time. Before we go further, if this is your first time hearing Maddie's story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We have viewers joining from all across the country. And honestly, knowing you're out there makes this work matter even more. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber helps this channel reach people who need to hear these stories told the right way. The call was logged, the officers arrived, and a case that would consume an entire city and eventually an entire nation had officially begun. The first officers on scene that Tuesday evening did what first responders are trained to do. They assessed, they documented, and they began working outward from the last known point of contact. Standard protocol for a missing child in the United States dictates that the first 60 to 72 hours are the most critical. Not because investigators stop caring after that window closes, but because the statistical reality of missing child cases is unambiguous. The longer the timeline extends without a confirmed sighting or physical evidence, the more the nature of the investigation shifts. What begins as a search becomes something else, something with a different weight to it. Jacksonville Sheriff's Office activated quickly. By the following morning, what had started as a neighborhood search had grown into something significantly larger. Additional patrol units, detectives, then specialized missing persons investigators. Then, as the days accumulated without resolution, federal resources, including involvement from the FBI's Crimes Against Children Unit, one of the most specialized investigative bodies in the country, specifically designed for cases exactly like this one. The physical search was extensive by any measure. Helicopters flew slow, overlapping grid patterns above Lakewood and the surrounding areas. A technique called systematic aerial search, designed to cover maximum ground while maintaining visual consistency across passes. What looks from the ground like a helicopter circling is, from the operational perspective, a carefully mapped sequence of corridors. Surinake 9 units work the streets, the yards, the drainage systems. Trained scent dogs operate on a principle most people don't fully appreciate. They are not simply following a smell. They are tracking the biological signature a human body leaves behind as it moves through an environment. Skin cells, respiratory output, the invisible trail that every person leaves without knowing it. Search teams combed wooded areas bordering the neighborhood. Drainage infrastructure was physically inspected. Ponds were assessed. A reward was announced publicly. A move that serves two simultaneous functions in missing child investigations. It generates tips, yes, but it also signals to the community that law enforcement is treating the case with full seriousness, which in turn encourages witnesses who might otherwise hesitate to come forward. Here is something worth understanding about how these investigations work, because it matters to what comes next. When a child goes missing and there is no physical evidence of a struggle, no confirmed sighting beyond the last known location, and no digital trail to follow, investigators operate under what's called an open victimology framework. Every person in the child's known environment becomes relevant. Family members, neighbors, regular visitors to the street, anyone whose daily pattern intersected with the victims. This is not suspicion cast broadly for its own sake. It is methodology. It is the systematic elimination of possibilities until what remains, however improbable it first appeared, becomes the only direction left. Interviews were conducted, timelines were cross-referenced, statements were taken and retaken, because inconsistency between a first account and a second account is often where investigations find their first real foothold. Several individuals were interviewed at length, including neighbors who had been among the last to see Maddie that afternoon. Hours of conversation, the same questions approached from different angles, details examined under pressure to see whether they held their shape. Hey, quick pause here. We want to know, what's the weather like where you're watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. And while you're there, have you ever followed a missing persons case in real time? Tell us about it below. The conversation in our comments section is always one of the best parts of this community. 4 days into the search, a decision was made that no one wanted to make. The active ground search was scaled back. In law enforcement language, this is described as a transition in investigative strategy. In human language, it meant something harder to say. The physical search of open terrain, the yards, the woods, the waterways, had not produced what it needed to produce. And that absence was, itself, a form of evidence. It pointed inward, towards something closer, towards somewhere the search had already been, or thought it had. There is a moment in every community crisis when the atmosphere changes permanently, not dramatically, not with a single announcement or a visible event. It happens in the small things first. The way a parent's hand lingers a little longer on a child's shoulder before school. The way a neighbor pauses at their window before turning away. Or the way a street that once felt like an extension of your living room suddenly feels like something that requires monitoring. That moment arrived in Lakewood sometime around day 3. The easy rhythms of the neighborhood, the unlocked doors, the children moving freely between yards, the unspoken agreement that this street was safe. Those things did not disappear overnight. They eroded, quietly, steadily, the way trust erodes when it has been given reason to question itself. Parents who had never tracked their children's movements with any particular anxiety were now doing exactly that. Kids who had roamed freely were being called inside earlier. Doors that had not been locked in years were being locked. Not out of panic, out of something more unsettling than panic. Out of the realization that they didn't actually know, and that the certainty they had built their daily lives around had never been tested. And now that it was being tested, it was not holding the way they had assumed it would. The media presence grew steadily through the first week. Local news crews established positions near the Clifton home. National outlets began picking up the story as the search extended without resolution. Maddie's photograph, that particular school photo that would become permanently associated with her name, appeared on television screens across Florida and eventually across the country. With media attention came the particular pressure that high-profile missing child cases generate on law enforcement. The public wants answers, cameras want statements, and investigators who operate best with time and discretion suddenly find themselves working inside a visibility they did not choose. Jacksonville Sheriff's Office maintained a careful public posture, releasing enough information to sustain community cooperation while protecting the integrity of an investigation that was, by this point, moving in a specific direction. Persons of interest had been identified. This is confirmed, not speculation. Investigators were actively focused on individuals within Maddie's immediate environment. A neighbor who had placed themselves among the last to see her that afternoon had been interviewed multiple times. The accounts given were examined carefully. Timelines were tested against each other. Nothing had broken open yet. But the investigative lens was narrowing. Or what? This is a good moment to pause and put something directly to you. At what point in this timeline do you think investigators began to suspect the answer was closer than anyone publicly acknowledged? Drop your theory in the comments. And if you're finding value in how this story is being told, please share this video. Not for the numbers, but because stories like Maddie's deserve to reach people who will engage with them seriously. Like this video if you're still with us. It genuinely helps more than you might think. By the end of the first week, the investigation had quietly shifted from a search operation to something more focused, more deliberate. The helicopters were gone. The large-scale ground teams had stood down. The neighborhood had gone from frantic motion to a tense, watchful stillness. And across the street from the Clifton home, behind a door that had already been opened and closed by investigators, something remained undiscovered. Not because it wasn't there, because no one had looked in exactly the right place. Not yet. 8 days after Maddie Clifton was last seen playing on her street, the answer came. Not from a wooded area on the edge of town, not from a drainage system or a pond, or any of the locations that search teams had methodically worked through in the days prior. It came from directly across the street, from a house that sat within eye line of the Clifton home, from a bedroom that belonged to a 14-year-old boy named Josh Phillips, a child Maddie knew, a face that belonged to the neighborhood, someone trusted. The discovery was made on November 11th, 1998. Melissa Phillips, Josh's mother, was in her son's bedroom. She noticed something beneath his waterbed, a smell that had been building for days, which Josh had attributed to a dead animal somewhere outside. She moved the bed frame. What she found ended the search. She called 911 immediately. Officers arrived within minutes. The scene was secured, and the investigation that had consumed Jacksonville for over a week collapsed into a single, devastating point of clarity. Maddie had been there the entire time, in a home that investigators had already entered, in a room that had already been visually assessed, hidden in a space that had not been physically examined with the thoroughness the moment required. Josh Phillips was taken into custody the same day. He was 14 years old. What emerged from the investigation in the hours and days that followed was a picture that defied easy categorization, because the instinct, when confronted with an act of this nature, is to reach for a framework that makes it comprehensible, to find the warning signs that should have been visible, to locate the moment where something should have intervened. The reality was more complicated than that. By most accounts, Josh Phillips was not a child who had been flagged. He was not known to law enforcement. He had not displayed the kind of overt behavioral indicators that in retrospect communities often point to as missed signals. He was, to the people around him, ordinary. And that ordinariness is precisely what makes this case so forensically and psychologically significant. And this is where the behavioral science becomes important. Because understanding what happened requires more than a timeline. It requires context. Research into juvenile offenders who commit acts of serious violence identifies several consistent psychological patterns. One of the most studied is what criminologists call concealment behavior. The actions taken after a violent event to hide evidence and maintain a normal external presentation. What makes juvenile concealment cases particularly complex is the developmental dimension. The adolescent brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control, consequence assessment, and long-term decision-making, is not fully developed until the mid-20s. This is not a legal defense. It is a neurological fact that the American Psychological Association and the American Medical Association and decades of peer-reviewed research have consistently documented. What this means in practical terms is that a 14-year-old's capacity to fully process the weight of their actions and to make rational decisions in the aftermath is neurologically distinct from that of an adult. This does not eliminate accountability. It contextualizes behavior in ways that matter enormously when the justice system has to decide what to do next. The community reaction to Josh Phillips's arrest was not a single emotion. It was several emotions simultaneously, and none of them simple. There was grief, which had been building for 8 days and now had somewhere to land. There was rage, the particular fury of a community that had trusted its own streets and felt that trust weaponized against it. And there was confusion because the person at the center of this was not a stranger. He was someone's son, someone who had played on the same street, someone whose face was familiar. And underneath all of it, running quiet and deep, was a question that no arrest could fully answer. How does something like this happen inside a world that looked exactly like this one? Where are you watching from right now? Seriously, just drop your location in the comments. We have people joining from all across the United States and beyond, and knowing this community is engaged with stories like Maddie's, told with the care they deserve, means everything. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The arrest of Josh Phillips on November 11th, 1998 set in motion a legal process that would force the state of Florida, and in many ways the entire country, to confront a question the justice system had never fully resolved. What do you do with a child who has committed an act that the law reserves its most severe consequences for? From the moment Phillips was taken into custody, the central legal question was not whether he was responsible. The physical evidence was unambiguous. The location of the discovery, the forensic findings, and the circumstances of the case constructed a factual record that left little room for alternative interpretation. The question was jurisdiction. In 1998, Florida law contained a provision that would define the entire trajectory of this case. Under Florida Statute 985, certain categories of offense committed by juveniles could be, and in some cases were required to be, transferred to adult court for prosecution. The severity of the charge, the age of the offender, and the nature of the crime were all factors the system weighed. Josh Phillips was 14 years old. The charge was first-degree murder. The state moved to try him as an adult. This decision was not procedurally unusual for Florida at the time. Throughout the 1990s, a national wave of juvenile crime legislation had pushed states toward tougher transfer provisions, the legal mechanism by which juvenile cases move into adult criminal court. Florida was among the most aggressive states in the country in applying these provisions, and what that meant in practical terms was that a 14-year-old would face the full weight of the adult criminal justice system: adult charges, adult courtroom procedures, adult sentencing guidelines. The trial proceeded in adult court. The evidence presented was extensive. Forensic findings from the scene, physical evidence recovered from the Phillips home, the timeline reconstructed through witness accounts and investigative documentation. The prosecution built a case around the factual record, methodical, detailed, and ultimately persuasive. The defense faced a landscape with very little room to maneuver. The physical evidence was not in dispute. What the defense could argue, and did argue, centered on the developmental and psychological dimensions of the case. The question of what a 14-year-old mind is capable of understanding, processing, and being held fully accountable for in the way adult sentencing structures assume. The jury was not persuaded to extend that consideration to the verdict. Josh Phillips was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 14 years old when the sentence was handed down. This is where the legal and ethical conversation becomes genuinely complex, and where understanding the broader framework matters. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling in Miller v. Alabama. The court held, in a 5-4 decision, not that mandatory life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. The ruling did not eliminate the possibility of life sentences for juveniles, but it required that sentencing courts consider the distinctive attributes of youth before imposing them. 4 years later, in Montgomery v. Louisiana, the Supreme Court ruled that Miller applied retroactively, meaning individuals already serving mandatory life without parole sentences for crimes committed as juveniles were entitled to new sentencing hearings. Josh Phillips fell within the scope of that ruling. In 2017, Phillips appeared before a Florida court for a resentencing hearing. The hearing required the court to consider his age at the time of the offense, his background, or his development, and whether his sentence reflected the constitutional standards Miller and Montgomery had established. The court resentenced him to life in prison, but with the possibility of parole after 25 years. That distinction, the addition of parole eligibility, represents one of the most significant legal developments in this case since the original conviction. It does not guarantee release. It creates a process through which release becomes a legal possibility rather than a permanent impossibility. This is a question worth sitting with, and we want to hear directly from you. Do you believe the justice system handled Josh Phillips' case appropriately, both at the original sentencing and at the resentencing hearing? Should the developmental science around juvenile brain development carry more weight in cases like this, or does the severity of the crime override those considerations? Drop your perspective in the comments. There is no single right answer here, and that is exactly why this conversation matters. Share this video with someone you think would engage seriously with that question. These are the discussions that shape how we think about justice, accountability, and what the law is actually for. The Clifton family sat through every moment of those proceedings. Steve and Sheila Clifton had buried their daughter. They had watched a trial, they had heard a sentence, and nearly 2 decades later, they sat in a courtroom again. This time watching the legal architecture around that sentence be restructured. In whatever position one holds on the legal and philosophical questions involved, that reality deserves to be acknowledged plainly. The family's pain did not have a resentencing hearing. It did not get reconsidered under new constitutional standards. It simply continued. Some cases close with a verdict and fade. This one didn't. The conviction of Josh Phillips answered the legal question at the center of the investigation. It established accountability in the formal, documented way that the justice system is designed to establish it. But it did not, could not, answer the questions that live beneath the legal ones, the ones that don't have statutes or precedents or evidentiary standards, the ones that simply remain. Steve and Sheila Clifton did not disappear from public life after the trial. They chose, and with the particular courage that only people who have survived the unsurvivable seem to access, to remain present, to speak, to ensure that their daughter's name continued to mean something beyond the case file it had become attached to. Sheila Clifton, in the years following the conviction, spoke publicly about the experience of grief that does not resolve, the kind that does not move through stages and arrive somewhere manageable, but instead becomes a permanent feature of daily life, something you learn to carry rather than something you set down. She spoke about Maddie, not about the case, about her daughter, about the child who noticed when people felt left out, about the 8-year-old who could move from a basketball in the driveway to a piano in the living room without losing a beat, about the person Maddie was becoming, and the person the world lost the chance to know. That insistence on Maddie as a person first, a victim second, is something the Clifton family maintained with remarkable consistency across decades of public attention. Jacksonville changed after November of 1998, not in ways that made the evening news, not through legislation or formal policy shifts, though those conversations happened. It changed in the quieter, more permanent way that communities change when something has happened that cannot be unhappened. The Lakewood neighborhood never fully returned to the version of itself that existed before that Tuesday afternoon. The unlocked doors, the children moving freely between yards, the unexamined trust in the safety of familiar streets. Those things did not simply resume. Some of them returned partially, in overtime. Others did not. Parents across Jacksonville, and, as the story spread nationally across the country, began having conversations with their children that previous generations had not felt necessary, about proximity, about trust, about the difference between familiarity and safety. Because one of the most significant things this case forced into public consciousness was a reality that remains deeply uncomfortable. The majority of crimes against children are not committed by strangers. They are committed by people the child knows, people the family knows, people whose faces belong to the landscape of daily life. That statistical reality, documented consistently across decades of research by the Department of Justice, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and child safety organizations nationwide, did not originate with Maddie's case, but her case gave it a human face that made it impossible to look away from. Maddie's story also contributed, in ways both direct and indirect, to the national conversation around child safety infrastructure that accelerated through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. The expansion of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Resources, the refinement of Amber Alert protocols, the increased federal investment in crimes against children investigative units. These developments emerged from a period shaped by cases like hers. Her absence in a painful and specific way made the system better at protecting children who came after her. Where the case stands now, Josh Phillips is currently incarcerated within the Florida Department of Corrections. Following the 2017 resentencing hearing, conducted in response to the Supreme Court's rulings in Miller versus Alabama and Montgomery versus Louisiana. His sentence was modified to life with the possibility of parole after serving 25 years. That threshold has now been reached. As of the time this script was written, Phillips has been eligible for parole consideration. It is important to be precise here about what that means and what it does not mean. Parole eligibility is not release. It is the opening of a legal process through which release can be considered, evaluated, and either granted or denied based on a structured assessment of multiple factors: institutional behavior, risk evaluation, victim impact, and the broader public interest. The Clifton family has remained engaged with this process. Their voices are part of the record that any parole consideration must contend with. No confirmed release has occurred as of this production. If that status changes, it will be covered, fully, carefully, and with the same commitment to accuracy that every part of this story has required. We started this story in the dark, flashlights moving through yards, voices calling a name into a silence that wouldn't answer back. A neighborhood standing in the street at midnight, holding something between hope and dread that no one had words for yet. We end it here, not with resolution because some things do not resolve, but with the person at the center of all of it. Maddie Clifton. She was 8 years old. She played basketball in the driveway and piano in the living room. She noticed when people felt left out and did something about it. She moved through her neighborhood like she belonged to all of it, because in the way that matters most, she did. She was not defined by what happened to her on a warm Tuesday afternoon in November of 1998. She was defined by every ordinary, irreplaceable moment that came before it. The way she introduced herself to children standing alone at the edge of a group. The way her parents watched her and saw someone becoming. The way neighbors looked back on her years later and reached, instinctively, for the same word. Everyone's child. That is not a small thing to carry forward from a story like this. It is, in fact, the only thing worth carrying. What this case leaves behind, beyond the legal record, beyond the headlines, beyond the debates about juvenile justice and sentencing and constitutional standards, is a question that does not have a clean answer. How do we hold space for all of it simultaneously? For the grief of a family that never stopped loving their daughter. For a justice system genuinely wrestling with what accountability means when the person being held accountable was a child. For a neighborhood that trusted its streets and learned something permanent about the limits of that trust. For a little girl who deserved to grow up. There is no verdict that answers all of those questions at once. There is only the commitment to keep asking them honestly, and to make sure that the people at the center of these stories are never reduced to the worst thing that happened to them. Maddie Clifton was more than this case. She always will be. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think or feel or see something differently, that is exactly what it was meant to do. Share it with someone who engages seriously with stories like this one. Leave a comment telling us what part of this case you're still thinking about. Subscribe if you haven't already, because every case we cover gets this same level of care, this same commitment to getting it right. And one last thing before you go. What do you think justice looks like in a case like this one? Not legally, but genuinely. What does it look like to you? Drop it below. We read every single comment, and we'll see you in the next one.